This is a capsule, and we're going to talk now about the meeting between Eduardo Bolsonaro and Paulo Figueiredo with Scott Bassett. Look at this cool thing. They were there, published this photo, and even included it with a... It was on the day the Haddad meeting was canceled. They were there talking to Bassett, but the worst part, my friend, isn't that. If I were Andre Estes, I would be very concerned. In a meeting conversation, Eduardo Bolsonaro reports non-compliance with the Magnitsky Act by Brazilian banks. Yes, my friend, this was bound to happen. This news was suggested by Xandiel Potter and Enigma da Toga, Adelio's lawyer in the Magnitsky case, and several other matters. Thanks to the people who suggested news on our website, Libertarian.com, and thanks to you for watching our video. If you like our content, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Well, look at this. On that day, you remember a few days ago, last Wednesday, Haddad was supposed to have a meeting with Scott Bassett, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, their equivalent of our Minister of Economy in the United States. The equivalent position to Haddad's here in Brazil. It was going to be a virtual meeting where they would discuss tariffs and such. Haddad published, it was even reported in the newspaper, saying that the Lula government is counting on Haddad's meeting with Scott Bassett to open a path for negotiations and whatnot. And then after all that excitement came the news that Scott Bassett had canceled the meeting with Haddad, and now we found out, Eduardo Bolsonaro posted this photo here, Eduardo Paulo Figueiredo, and Scott Bassett, who had a meeting, and according to him, it was on the day Haddad's meeting was canceled. To understand the difference, right? Who effectively represents Brazil abroad? It's the Bolsonaros. That's it, there's no other way. Lula may have been elected president here through that C scheme, kind of crazy, putting their thumb on the scale, allowing propaganda only for one side. Prohibiting propaganda from the other side, everything the right does. But it's a coup. Whatever, it's forbidden, not allowed. The left makes an absurd order. Anyway, they managed to put Lula in the presidential chair. It's true, but that doesn't mean he's legitimate. Who represents Brazil abroad continues to be Bolsonaro. Here, Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro from PL published a photo on Friday alongside us Treasury Secretary Scott Bassett. According to Eduardo, the two met last Wednesday in a closed-door meeting. Their meeting allegedly took place on the same day that, according to Finance Minister Fernando Haddad, he was rushing to meet with Bassett. Officially, the American secretary claimed he had no time for Haddad. See how honest he is. He was honest. He had a meeting with Eduardo Bolsonaro and Paulo Figueiredo. He didn't have time to meet with Haddad. Who thinks he's the president of Brazil? Here, in the conversation between Finance Minister Haddad and the American secretary, we expected both to discuss, among other topics, the tariffs imposed by the U.S., the anti-diplomatic militancy of these far-right forces operating in the White House. No, my friend. You got what you wanted. You pulled off a coup here in Brazil. You managed to get the convicted man out of prison and put him in the presidential chair. To this day, I still can't understand how this worked, but anyway, that's what's happening. Now, wanting legitimacy on top of all that for this government, that's asking too much, my friend. It has no legitimacy. Here, look, we received this information 2 days after the announcement I made, when Eduardo publicly gave an interview saying he would seek to inhibit this type of contact between these two governments. After this interview came the episode, and there's no way not to connect one thing to the other. It's not a coincidence. In other words, Haddad is trying to blame Eduardo Bolsonaro for not having a meeting with Bassett. But Haddad has already shown that he believes Bassett has the right to choose. He is not obligated to listen to Eduardo Bolsonaro. He could have spoken with Haddad. The point is that Bassett knows who's right and who's wrong. Wrong in the story, as long as the Brazilian government keeps pretending that everything is fine, that it's a legitimate government, that we're not under a judicial dictatorship here in Brazil, that the proceedings against Bolsonaro are not a complete absurdity. Oh no. Everything is normal, all within democratic normalcy and so on. As long as they continue to bury their heads in the sand, hiding this truth, they're going to get screwed, and worse still, they're going to screw over all of Brazil, right? But we're going to get badly screwed because look, the worst part of this story isn't even that, right? Here's Globo trying to say that, oh poor Haddad, the American secretary didn't want to speak with him, but preferred to speak with Eduardo Bolsonaro. What a fame. Right? Here it is, in a meeting with Bassett, Eduardo Bolsonaro reports non-compliance with the Magnitsky law by Brazilian banks. I don't know, man. It's just that I don't invest in anything here in Brazil. But if I had shares in a Brazilian bank, my friend, I'd sell them fast, because things are going to stink. It's Eduardo's meeting, Bolsonaro's meeting, with Paulo Figueiredo and Scott Bassett on Wednesday served to have Brazilians bring to the Treasury Secretary a report on how the Magnitsky law is being interpreted by Brazilian banks. According to Figueiredo, the material delivered to Bassett included news reports published in the Brazilian press about the law's implementation. In the case of Minister Alexandre de Moraes, that is those news reports that said no, that the banks understood it's only dollar transactions that are prohibited, that he can use his real denominated accounts and so forth. He just can't use dollar denominated accounts or make dollar transfers. International credit cards, that's, if it's here in Brazil, debit cards, there's no problem, no need to cancel his accounts, right? In other words, there are news reports stating that Moraes didn't have his checking accounts suspended by the banks where he's a client. We know that at least Banco do Brasil has an account, not sure about other banks. Still, according to Figueiredo, Bassett says the law is uniform, there aren't two levels, and promised to take action. Things are going to get more interesting. It's just what I told you. What's their strategy? They're not going to expand the Magnitsky law to other people now. They're not going to target other ministers, at least not for now. What they're going to do now is put more pressure on Alexandre de Moraes, target his wife, his children, put everyone in this package, and ensure they don't have access to the financial system, meaning it has to be something much heavier on Alexandre de Moraes. Even to serve as an example for others, to see how people will fare in this situation and so forth. And it's true that Brazilian banks will now be in a dilemma because it's obvious this will happen. What's going to happen? They're already saying they'll force Brazilian banks not to follow the Magnitsky Act. And fine, they can do that with banks that are here in Brazil. The whole problem with this situation is that they're going to bank. Why? Because banks will lose access to SWIFT networks, international transfers, and access to the American market. In other words, it will be a devastating loss for Brazilian banks. They'll have to shut down half their operations in the United States. Actually, all their operations in the United States. In fact, half their global operations. Just to comply with Alexandre de Moraes here in Brazil, you can see how difficult it's going to be. It serves right the people from Faria Lima who voted for Lula because Bolsonaro couldn't. They pretended to be sick with COVID. Let's vote for the communist. What else could happen? The corrupt one takes over, the guy who wants to fight with the whole world to side with China, following Putin. What are we going to do? That's right, they voted for these people, the folks from Faria Lima in Sao Paulo, and that's it, we're completely screwed. In other words, the chaos is about to start now. I don't know when they're going to do this, okay? I still think the United States is trying to assess what the impact of this will be. But today we already got the date set for Bolsonaro's trial. It's not like this is news. Everyone already knew it would be in September, right? Everyone already knew that Alexandre de Moraes had reserved all 4 September sessions for Bolsonaro's trial. So it doesn't make complete sense. September 2nd was scheduled for the start of the trial. It was more or less what was already expected. But anyway, the fact that the STF has scheduled this hearing, this vote, already indicates that there is at least an intention to continue with this absurd process with absolutely no legal logic. My friend, Brazilian banks are going to have problems, you know? They're going to have serious problems. I think people are really going to need. Get ready if you end up isolated here in Brazil, okay? And then notice this is a big problem, man, because the entire Brazilian export sector requires dollars, right? And then Brazilian banks won't be able to buy and sell or hold dollars here. Trade in dollars, in other words, the entire Brazilian export sector is going to be affected by this measure. It's absurd and worrying for Brazilian banks to end up in this situation, playing along with this charade of no, I'm going to interpret it this way, and who knows what else, and so on. Let's see how this plays out. For more information about our project, visit our website shown on the screen.